Hello, Kat and Phoebe.
Hello.
Hi.
Now, Phoebe, you're going to have to repeat that because that was apparently not a resonant enough hi for you to actually appear on the screen.
Hello. Hello, world.
That's much better. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. And you are Kat Rosenfield and Phoebe Maltz-Bovey. Phoebe, has anyone ever complimented you on the distinctiveness of your name?
People have been annoyed at me on account of apparently having a sort of two last names like this in Britain would suggest that you're an aristocrat, which is no.
Not the truth?
Unfortunately, no. So once I was called out for being a British aristocrat.
Okay.
But neither British nor aristocrat.
It's definitely a name I have not heard. I mean, if you put all three words together, I think I've never heard.
I'm probably the only one.
Yeah, I would imagine, and that's a good thing. So let me explain the nature of this gathering. So one thing you two and I have in common is that we have shows that appear on Blogging Heads TV. I have The Wright Show, and in fact, this is an edition of The Wright Show. And it appears, actually, some of them appear on Blogging Heads and some of them on Meaning of Life TV. Long story. In any event, it's also an audio podcast, The Wright Show. You two host Feminine Chaos on Blogging Heads TV, and that is also an audio podcast to which people can subscribe. And there's two reasons I wanted you to come on my show. One is so you can explain modern feminism to me, contemporary feminism. I lost touch with feminism decades ago, and I think I should become more conversant in it. And I guess the other is, cross promotion. Is that the term? Like when I used to watch Bad Network TV, this would have been like characters from Green Acres showing up on Petticoat Junction. Have you two even heard of either of those shows?
Green Acres. I've heard of it.
Green Acres I recommend because that was ahead of its time. That has an absurdist quality that continues to play well. Petticoat Junction, not so much. And
I think the more contemporary version would be when Law and Order SVU does crossovers with Law and Order, the original.
That sounds like a good example.
Well, cross-pollination.
Yeah. And so that's what's happening. Why don't we talk a little about your show? Where did the name Feminine Chaos come from? Is that a reference to Jordan Peterson?
No.
Chaos is not.
No, it is. It is a reference to that, but I think it's not a reference in the sense of our show having anything to do with him or his ideas particularly at all. It's more just I think we heard that expression through that, and it just seemed amazing.
I mean, it's technically it's a Jungian reference, right? The chaotic feminine,
But that's why I guess it came in the news.
Did Peterson use the term feminine chaos, that whole thing, or just?
Not sure.
Chaos is a big part of his, like the edge of chaos and so on is a big thing. And then I didn't know about Jung, but there's so much I don't know about Jung. So, okay. So is there anything else we should know about what this means?
I think there's a sort of a bit of a gender angle to a lot of what we discuss. Not everything, but I don't know. Neither of us, it came up, I think, on our podcast once before, neither of us have actually formally studied gender studies. So we are
amateurs.
We are amateurs.
That's where the chaos comes in.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, and also, maybe I'll tell you what, here would be a good challenge for me. By the end of the show, after you explain to me the landscape of feminism, I assume there are different kinds of feminists. But anyway, by the end of this, I should be able to venture a guess as to where you two belong on the landscape. I actually have a kind of a theory about that, but I'll. Oh,
I want to know the theory.
You want to know the theory?
Yeah.
I would say if you just see it as a one-dimensional spectrum, like left to right, I would think that you identify as progressives, but are on the right side of progressive, and I don't mean to suggest that you're both exactly alike, but the kind of the perspective that sometimes emerges from your show is let's just say a not an uncritical embrace of the leftier things. Does that make any sense?
I think actually part of our tagline is dissident feminism.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we do poke at the kind of dogma present in contemporary feminism from time to time, or maybe by default.
Mm-hmm. For sure, but
Right.
I think we sometimes do it also sort of from the left. I don't think it's necessarily that we poke at the dogma from the right. I think sometimes the things that are sort of purported to be really, really progressive feminism seem a little ridiculous sort of from the left also. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's in a way, you're right. The whole spectrum is misleading because, for example, if you look at identity politics, to which this is not entirely unrelated, it gets blowback from the right and sometimes from the left, you know, from kind of the Bernie Sanders left. So this is, maybe I'm speaking in, as they would say today, too simplistic a way, as they used to say, a simplistic way. But we won't get into my grievances about certain things that have happened to our language. Why, when I was a boy, simplistic, to say too simplistic was redundant.
Ooh.
This is totally news to you guys. That's
Actually,
how far things have fallen. No, people aren't even aware of what was once a controversy about proper use.
But couldn't things be relative? Couldn't something be more simplistic than something else? Or is it binary?
But in the old usage, like 40 years ago, simplistic meant excessively simple. So simplistic meant too simple. You're oversimplifying and therefore losing something. So to say too simplistic, well, I guess you could say like you're too cruel, and cruel is inherently bad. Never mind. This is definitely not the direction which I meant to take the conversation. It's just that I haven't had any other chance to complain about the current use of simplistic. So let's talk about the taxonomy of feminism, if there is such a thing. About 25 years ago, I wrote a piece for the New Republic that called for me to do some research into the landscape of feminism and ask people, like, what are the labels for describing contemporary feminists? And at that point, 3 labels I remember were the equity feminists. I'm not sure exactly what they meant. The difference feminists was the second one. Difference feminists did say that men and women are different in significant ways, although they were a little fuzzy on whether that was like genetic or what. And then there were the radical feminists like Andrea Dworkin, and then that meant something else. Those are the 3 big labels that emerged. Are there labels now for kinds of feminists?
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
Good. What are they?
Well, I think there's labels. There are labels. There are also some sort of derogatory labels that are.
Right. You've got types of feminism. You've got waves of feminism.
Right. I mean, I guess there's a few there's a few terms that kind of jump out at me, but they're not all equivalent. So I wouldn't say that these are all like branches of feminism. They're more just sort of different things that come up. So there's intersectional feminism, which is it comes from the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw's concept. I cannot say concept apparently, of intersectionality having to do with the sort of specific experiences. Mostly this has to do with Black women, but it could be different groups and how the experience, how you can't just kind of add the experiences of a white woman and a Black man and arrive at the experiences of a Black woman. That was a perhaps excessively simplistic way of putting it. Just kidding. Just regular simplistic.
Just plain vanilla simplistic.
Plain vanilla.
And then deriving from intersectional feminism, this is one of the more derogatory versions. You have white feminism, which is usually a term lobbed at a woman who is a feminist who is also white, who's perceived to be engaging in an insensitive, racially or culturally or what have you, insensitive version of feminism.
And confusingly with both of these terms, actually. So white feminism, I have seen applied to just kind of white women generally, and I can be very specific about where I've seen this, the 53% of white women voters who went for Trump was in various op-eds, which I actually do know what I'm thinking of, but I won't bother naming it again. That group of women, the white women who voted for Trump, gets sort of referred to as a failing of white feminism. And you might think, well, are these women feminists or just women? Right. So that's one place. And also then in turn, intersectional feminist has a kind of derogatory meaning as well, where it can be used to refer to the kind of overly sort of hypersensitive millennial, which whatever I guess we are, but yeah, millennial feminism. But then there's also, so you had mentioned radical feminism. So that phrase you still hear, but more in the context of trans exclusionary radical feminism.
Oh man, this is
some say is a slur, others say is a description, but it would be a hard thing. It's hard to say that that's like a branch of feminism. It's more kind of I don't even know what it is. It's a discussion that happens in feminist circles, but it's not exactly like a school of thought.
Okay. And Kat, if you want to say something, then people would be able to look at your actual cat. No, your cat has disappeared. Okay, there's a
yeah, I should probably just say that, periodically a tail may kind of come through the.
Yeah, is your cat behind you right now?
He's on my lap licking my hands.
Okay.
So we'll see, we'll see if I can keep my face from betraying what's happening below the bra line here.
Okay.
But and then of course there are feminazis, but that's not something that we
that's
call
a Rush
ourselves.
Limbaugh. Now but that leads to a question I have actually, is like, have we gotten to a point where kind of all women, not all women, but like all women who like write and stuff, you might say, I don't know, intellectuals, elites, whatever you want to say, that they all call themselves feminists. I think there was a time when many conservative women might determinedly say, I'm not a feminist. I don't think Phyllis Schlafly ever said she was a feminist, probably. On the other hand, these days, certainly women who you think of as on the right, like Christina Hoff Sommers, I've had her on the show, and I'm pretty sure she says she's a feminist. It's an argument over what feminism should be. So am I right in thinking like a greater percentage of women who write about these issues would say that they are feminists than was the case long ago? Or do we know?
I would think so, because I would imagine so, because I think there is more stigma on saying you're not than saying you are. I think it no longer has necessarily any connotations. It's become, there's critiques saying it's too commercialized or something like that, but it's become kind of, Ivanka Trump has said that she's a feminist and that her father is a feminist.
Right.
So.
Once Beyonce stood, in front of a giant light up feminist sign wearing, like a spangled leotard at the VMAs a few years ago, I think feminism, I don't know if you'd say it jumped the shark, but it certainly had become mainstream to the point of maybe being a little bit meaningless. I don't know.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Is there anything that all of the people who call themselves feminists actually have in common? Could you say that at some level of generality, this is what feminists, self-described feminists believe, and then all these differences pop up on closer inspection? Or is there really nothing they have in common? They would all, well, I'll leave the question to you.
I think, what the dictionary definition is, belief in equality between the sexes, which I think, everybody, even people who don't necessarily describe themselves as feminists, would subscribe to that particular notion.
Well, I don't know if I think there's a whole new, not new, entirely new, but sort of a revived anti-feminism with like incels and the various troll Twitter accounts saying women should dress in a feminine way and have, 20 children by the time they're 20 or whatever, these troll accounts, you know what I mean? So there is this there's certainly anti-feminism out there, but in terms of what feminism itself is, I think it's if you're going to be inclusive of everybody who uses a term in reference to their own views, it's kind of everything. I mean, yeah, there's so much, there isn't even agreement among feminists for sort of who this is for. Like, sometimes you see like categories like women and femmes, or women, like everybody but cisgender men. That's who feminism is for. Other people have different views. You know, there's a lot of disagreement. I think there's just too much disagreement within, even if you're just talking about the people who've actually kind of thought it through a bit. But if you talk about everybody who's just like, yeah, I'm a feminist, I think it's pretty meaningless. And I think I have a poodle who has one or two opinions on the matter.
Okay, but has not yet made an appearance.
No, because the door is over there and much more interesting.
Okay. I mean, I assume all these people would say no one should be discriminated against on the basis of their gender. They would say that.
Yeah.
Probably, although it could be, somebody could be in favor of affirmative action for women, however defined.
Well, that's where the differences would pop in. I mean, some would say that inequality of outcome is evidence of discrimination, and some wouldn't. And the ones who said the first would probably be more likely.
That's true. I think that's probably the sort of umbrella that everyone would be under.
Okay.
As a feminist.
Before we go further, you mentioned waves. One of you did. We should quickly review the wave. What have there been now? 3 waves of feminism?
3.
And what's the?
I thought aren't we in the 4th?
No, I think that we're in the 3rd, and some people really like the 4th to come crashing ashore right now.
I'm ready for it, but what would that be? Why don't we start with first? First was in the 50s?
No, the first was the suffragettes.
No, the suffragettes.
Oh, the suffragettes. Okay.
Yeah.
So just like fundamental things like the right to vote, eliminate just glaring forms of discrimination. And then
the right to vote, the right to own property, to be equal citizens in the eyes of the law. Second wave was in tandem with the sexual revolution. You've got Gloria Steinem, you've got Ms. Magazine.
So Betty Friedan would be second too, though, right?
Yeah.
Like that sort of. So the second wave is also, so there's what the second wave was, but then there's also kind of how the second wave, and this is maybe also relevant to what we're talking about, but how it's, what it's kind of code for today when people talk about second wave feminism is different from what it actually was. Today, it's kind of code for like stodgy, older, wealthy white women who are out of touch and their feminism. That's what it actually was, as I understand it, was a little bit more intersectional than is caricatured.
But the stereotype is that these were relatively affluent women who felt trapped in the suburbs, which is fine as far as it goes, but there are other kinds of grievances that other kinds of women had that they didn't.
Exactly. That basically these were people whose only form of marginalization was being women, and who had a very specific set of grievances based on not being in the workforce and not being the paid workforce, basically because their households didn't require it financially. So that would be that they would have different relationships to reproductive rights, all sorts of issues, and that basically that they imagined that feminism was simply their plight and nothing wider. So that's sort of the caricature, maybe sometimes the truth, but not always the truth of, I would say, second wave.
Okay.
And what's the third, Kat? Because I'm not entirely sure.
The third is nebulous because we're in it.
Okay.
So I would say like the sex positive feminism that kind of sprang up in response to the purity culture that sprang up in response to the second wave of feminism. So I would say like starting maybe around, in the 2000s would be the third wave, right? Does that sound right to you, Phoebe?
I think there was some in the 90s too, but because there's some books.
Second wave. You were coming off the 80s.
I don't know.
That was certainly second wave.
I mean, I read this book that recently that was from the 90s that was about the kind of sexual harassment type debates of that era. And some of the essays in it were older, but it seemed like not so different from the debates today. So I'm not sure.
So did I understand when you said that third wave was sex positive, was the idea that second wave feminism had viewed sex as sometimes at least a kind of a form of male oppression or exploitation to such an extent that kind of sex itself started to be viewed as what do you mean?
You're talking about Andrea Dworkin specifically.
Right. And I just her book, just that I got it on hold from the library and it just became available and it's like just on my shelf, and I have yet to I read the collection of her stuff, but not Intercourse itself. Intercourse is waiting. But yes, absolutely. So I don't think that all of second wave feminism was radical feminism. I think, and I guess I wonder whether all of third wave, I feel like sex positive feminism, I think of as maybe like a part of the more recent feminism, but like only one branch of it. Because then there's the whole Me Too feminism, which is not necessarily sex negative, but it seems like something very far afield from sex positive feminism.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of there being a clash between the two. I mean, I assume that sex positive feminism entails the idea that you get to choose, the person that is not just that you're having sex with, but the person who kind of persistently is flooding you with innuendo and stuff.
I think that right now, we've been talking about the kind of like, even within the waves, there have been factions, there have been conflicts. So in the third wave, something that you see a lot, in terms of discussion happening right now, is you've got people like Christina Hoff Sommers, who I think call themselves equity feminists, who are big into equal opportunity, women's agency. And then on the other side, you've got, and these tend to be younger women, who are more in the kind of Me Too, hashtag believe women, hashtag protect women, that camp, active on Twitter, writing threads about how they live in fear of men. That's a thing.
Yeah. I think I would say that I almost wonder how much the sort of sex positivity is a part of feminism is versus like, that's just kind of where the culture was for a while. And then there's been pushback against it. And that has included feminism, but yeah.
So did I understand you correctly to say that, this equity feminism you described in kind of Christina Hoff Sommers, that is associated with third wave, or?
She calls herself an equity feminist, I'm pretty sure.
Right.
And I think she is basically one of this faction that's trying to reclaim feminism from the other version that is seen by certain people. I should just go ahead and say that, like, I think I'm more on this side, that I see it as infantilizing to women. It's something where you see sort of like in the midst of the Me Too movement, where you've got people sort of recasting formerly consensual encounters as having been non-consensual, or where you've got things like women who are in their mid-20s are being talked about like their children.
Yes, this sort of thing, basically the convergence of a progressive, ostensibly feminist view of sexuality with sort of a more puritanical approach, which can happen, when you have something where a woman who's like 25 gets referred to just by virtue of her age as being sort of too young for some relationship. And it's like, but isn't she kind of an adult there? And for sure. That's something that's new. But I think there could still be a feminism. This is what I would like for there to be, is a feminism that can both question sort of certain norms in the abstract without announcing that specific individual couples have done feminism wrong by virtue of their ages or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And Kat, were you saying you agree that certain kinds of Me Too grievances are infantilizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about this, Phoebe and I, on our podcast. That I'm trying to think.
Well, kind of the Aziz Ansari, the kind of
yes,
a very bad date being cast as something approaching a crime.
Right. Where we've talked about the sort of flattening of the discourse surrounding sex that is wanted, but not ultimately what you wanted. Where it's just not good, and maybe it makes you feel terrible afterwards. And we've talked before. This has been in conjunction with various Me Too era stories, including like the Louis C.K. thing. Who he always comes up on our podcast. It's a little bucket list item. You always have to mention Louis. But instances where something happened, that wasn't good, and a woman needs to reckon with it. But where it doesn't necessarily have to mean that somebody was victimized, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has occurred to me in the course of this Me Too thing that, and I should say, like, I know several people who were taken down in the Me Too thing. I mean, they've been colleagues in the past, and like, I was at the New Republic with Leon Wieseltier, and the thing is, I was actually not aware. I mean, a lot of the kinds of stories you heard about Leon when this came out were not things I had heard of at the time. Maybe they happened later. Maybe it was just all kept quiet. But at the same time, I remember thinking, on the other hand, if I had heard them, I wouldn't have said call the police, and nobody would have in those days, just because you would have said, yeah, creepy guy, a lot of it around, but it wasn't the kinds of things, I mean, I'm sure you're quite aware of this. The rules have changed.
Well, I think a couple things about this. So first is that I think strength of the Me Too movement has, if it could even be called a movement, the strength of the moment, whatever, is that there are things that were in fact upsetting to women at the time. I don't know about those specific things, but in general, there were that women did not feel able to speak up about at the time. And it's not, and just the fact that stuff is only coming out now doesn't necessarily, you can't necessarily infer from that, oh, well, now people are just hopping on this trend and they clearly didn't mind it at the time. Maybe they did mind it at the time, but they just...
Oh, I think they minded it at the time. And Leon, the women who complain now about Leon, I think minded it at the time.
So that would be one thing I would say about Me Too. But the other, though, is that I think one thing that hasn't gone as well is the famous question of nuance and how to talk about cases where somebody has been creepy. So this also came up when we were talking about when Kat and I were talking about the Al Franken story, where somebody has definitely been creepy. Have they done anything sort of cancellation worthy? Well, not necessarily. And that's what it's been tricky to kind of articulate, because it seems like there are always just these two possibilities: either to brush something off as not actually a big deal, or to say that somebody's basically the same as Weinstein or Epstein, when in fact there is this whole big middle ground, and a lot of behavior that should be called out as not great, but should not get the person who did it necessarily canceled.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's okay if the rules are changing. The rules, I mean, up to a point. I mean, I don't think, it doesn't sound like Aziz Ansari did anything criminal. Okay, fine. But for the most part, the stuff that's been complained about seems to me like fine stuff to complain about. And moral rules get rewritten. And now that's something that gets stigmatized for. And you could say that maybe the people whose behavior was kind of retrospectively stigmatized are in a sense a victim of the rules changing. On the other hand, they were at a minimum creepy guys at the time, so it's not the greatest injustice that's ever been done.
I mean, this is something we talk about with respect to Louis C.K., who, the creepy stuff he did when he asked women if he could masturbate in front of them, 15 years ago. It was not that he couldn't have anticipated that come 2018, that was going to be such an egregious offense, especially since he didn't think that he'd done anything non-consensual at the time, that it was going to result in the destruction of his career or the cancellation of a film and all of that stuff. So, it is difficult. And like Phoebe was saying, there's really not a middle ground right now for talking about this stuff where you can acknowledge, like, maybe that shouldn't have happened. Maybe it was an abuse of power. Without having to go an entire step further to say, and so you need to go in a cave and never come out. We never want to see you again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of just one thing I would just add about the rules changing, I think I agree that the rules needed to change. I think the question is how have they changed, and did they need to change in the way that they seem to be changing? And this is even setting aside the question of how much rules have actually changed. I suspect not that much. I think on the ground, outside of these very famous cases, life goes on as always. I don't think that this has actually
really, because I hear a lot of men say they are much more careful.
Well,
to the point, what's that?
Huh?
To the point, where it's difficult, just because little, remarks that might have seemed just natural and harmless to them, they think twice about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the rules changing, though, the question is, is having a situation where every single workplace, where it's like the worst thing in the world if two coworkers start dating because it's work, even if they're not even one the superior of the other, like, is that actually better? Do all women actually want that? Is something to stop and think about. And I think sometimes the rules changing it's just clearly like things were gotten away with that shouldn't have been. But I think there are sort of cases around the edges where it's actually arguably bad for everybody for, a certain amount. Like, what needed to change were more like the structural dynamics of that always being a man who's the boss in certain fields, more or less, rather than that there would be workplace flirtation to begin with, things like that.
Right. Yeah. Who's the woman at Slate who's married to the former editor of Gawker? She wrote a piece about how, hey, I met my husband in this kind of context and I don't regret it. I don't remember her name. But
I remember the article, but I don't remember.
Benedict or something is in, maybe your last name. Anyway, and I think his last name is Cook. But one thing that occurred to me, and I think you kind of alluded to this, is that if you ask, like, who, back when I was at the New Republic, what kinds of people would have been most likely to complain about the kind of behavior that is now being stigmatized, actually a lot of them would have, like, for example, my conservative Southern Baptist parents, if they had witnessed the behavior of Leon Wieseltier, they would have condemned it. So, I mean, in those days, I think as much of the blowback would have come from conservative circles as from lefty circles. I mean, is that kind of consistent with some of the things you're saying about this?
Yeah, I think so, right?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a lot, how, the things like the push for affirmative consent policies and affirmative consent laws has had the effect, instead of empowering, broader and more freeing ideas of how people, and women especially, can engage in sex, that it's instead kind of operating from this presumption that's very puritanical and very conservative, that a woman's default position is to never actually want sex. Like, what
exactly,
women want that.
Exactly. I mean, that's really, I think that there's this way that the conversation just keeps steering each news story towards the same stories that would have kind of been like to titillate the readers of the news like 50 or 100 years ago, where it's always like a powerful older man preying on the young innocent woman. And it's like there's something, it's hard to sort of pinpoint. This is something I've been trying to write about, and I have trouble like with explaining this in a way that doesn't seem to be dismissive of the aspects of it that are useful, but where there's just this one, it kind of keeps steering the conversation back to this one narrative that kind of fails to take into account the possibility, and this gets back to what Kat was saying about infantilization of like a sort of an adult woman with some sort of agency of her own.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do really well, like we've come around to the idea that women can be full agents, especially in the realm of sex and relationships, but we don't do so well with the idea that they might use that agency to sometimes make really bad decisions that they come to regret and have to reckon with and have to take responsibility for.
Yeah, and they don't have monopoly on bad decisions, I would say, speaking as a male. But so there's a question here that maybe underlies some of this and is relevant to it, and it's about gender differences. So some of the people who 30 years ago might have been conservatives complaining about some of this behavior would have been operating on the assumption that men and women are just different, that there are fundamental differences between them, and that, okay, I mean, if you take something that Leon Wieseltier was said to have done that certainly nobody would have reported to the police at the time, which is to say, he made a remark about a dress someone was wearing. I think it was the only thing wrong with that dress is that it's not tight enough. And it was public. It was a public remark. It was like at a, several people heard it and he meant for them to, and so on. I think these people would say, you have to understand that for a woman that can just feel differently than it would if you were a man and some woman made a comparable remark about you. It's a different psychology. There are different vulnerabilities and so on. And one thing I'm wondering is, are there, my sense is that within progressive discourse generally, a kind of default assumption is that there are no differences between males and females that have any kind of a deep, like genetic basis or anything that are relevant to the discussion. Do you think I'm wrong?
Well, I think it's more just that this notion that when culture could potentially explain something, you don't want to just default to assuming that it's biology. And I would say, just to return to the example you give, if Leon Wieseltier was the boss in this context, it seems more relevant that he was the boss than that he was a man, because people will sort of laugh at the boss's jokes, even if they think the boss has made an inappropriate joke. And that's just, that is a gender neutral thing that can happen. What's not gender neutral is who's most likely to be the boss in a workplace, right? So I think that's, I see it more, at least, I don't know whether I'm speaking just for myself here or for all progressives everywhere. I'll speak for myself. I think of it not as that there couldn't possibly be any differences between men and women, but rather that many things that are fairly easy to explain for other reasons get kind of attributed to biology.
Okay. But if you look at kind of the standard, like the most basic kind of differences that would be asserted by, say, kind of mainstream evolutionary psychologists, and I've written about this, that say men are less discriminating about sex partners, more likely to be sexually attracted to someone they have actually no personal interest in, things like that. And of course, all these are just group differences. No one's asserting that you can, with complete confidence, predict the behavior of any member of the group. But the argument is that they are average kind of group differences that do have some grounding in genetic differences for kind of intelligible reasons having to do with the way natural selection works. That I assume that's just not.
I don't know. I find
So like the thing that what I'm thinking of, I don't know if it's the same thing you're referring to, but it instantly came to mind when you talked about like evolutionary psychology studies about, who's more default attracted to somebody they've never met or more willing to have sex with someone they've never met. This study took place on a college campus where, an attractive man or an attractive woman would approach people and, basically invite them back to their place to have casual sex. And what they found was that men were more likely to take the woman up on that offer than women were likely to take the man up on that offer. And that this data was extrapolated to mean all kinds of things about how men are wired versus how women are wired. And I hate this study because
as do I.
It fails to take into account so many things. I mean, including obviously the kinds of safety concerns a woman is likely to have as opposed to a man, but also, to boil it down and maybe be a little bit gross about it, whether as a woman going home with a complete stranger to have sex, like whether you're likely to actually enjoy yourself as opposed to, a man, you may well enjoy yourself. But you want to talk about things that are inherently different between men and women, how enjoyable your sexual encounter can be with a stranger you've never met purely because of anatomy.
Also, I don't think that there's anybody, I mean, there's obviously, the whole question of not all women have any particular sort of anatomy, not all men have any particular sort of anatomy. That aside, I think there's still pretty much, I'm not talking like far left Tumblr, I'm talking in general. I think on the left there is still an understanding that the people who could get pregnant from a sexual encounter tend to be the women, right? And I think that's not about who inherently is wired to want what, but I think even if in a purely non-violent society, the risks of sex is just of heterosexual sex is different for a man and a woman, and I don't think. I don't think anybody's really arguing. I don't think there's like, I was pregnant too recently to, it's, right. I mean, I'm the one nursing in the middle of the night. It's not a social construct. I mean,
Right. And the argument from evolutionary psychology is that this would have been having consequences for the gene pool since long before the human species even existed. I mean, it manifestly does in other species.
But I guess my problem in general with these evolutionary psychology takes on human behavior in actual society is that there's so much else going on. So it's not that evolution and biology have nothing to do. You just can't know how much, because there is also society. There's also, so the woman who doesn't want to have the casual sexual encounter is living in a society where she has been told since childhood that only sluts do that, right? Would be the sort of way to put it, and maybe she desperately wants to have sex with a guy, but doesn't feel she can because X, Y, and Z. And it's very hard to say if it's not that it couldn't be evolution, but it's not, you just don't know. I feel like it's too hard to know. And I think there's just, when there's so much going on, I think, to just treat it like we're just some species without culture kind of misses a lot.
Well, I don't think sophisticated evolutionary psychologists do that, but but in any event, I guess that's the answer to my question is there's no like school of progressive feminists who are actively embracing any claims about gender differences that might be made by evolutionary psychologists and trying to integrate them into their analysis of the world. It's just
actually,
are there?
I mean, I was going to say that sometimes when you have these conversations about, women having relationships with men where they consent to sex that maybe they didn't actually want, frequently what will be invoked is the 3,000 years of, male privilege and patriarchal oppression thing where, which boils down to in pretty much every scenario where a man and a woman are involved, the woman could potentially be attacked and overpowered by the man who is going to be anatomically, biologically larger and stronger.
But I feel like that's still a cultural argument that's being made, right? I mean, it's saying that it's like the history of racism, the history of sexism. I don't know. I know. I think
it goes back though to, it frequently boils down to, I don't feel safe because the man is physically bigger and stronger.
Okay.
Not just culturally likely to attack me, but,
I see.
But if it were to happen.
I mean,
I mean, I don't like that argument because I think, it is sexist, essentially, to paint every man as a potential attacker just by virtue of the fact that he's probably more physically powerful. But that is a thing that you can sometimes see. So if you're looking for an instance where progressive feminists sometimes make kind of biologically essentialist arguments about the sexes, that might qualify.
Yeah, but even that, I mean, that's not so much that isn't that just positing a kind of a rational reaction by a woman to the fact that the guy could overpower her? Or am I misunderstanding you? I mean, that's different from saying that there are deep-seated differences, for example, in the nature of jealousy and so on, that evolutionary psychologists...
You're talking specifically about psychology. Yeah, no, that's more about...
Oh, boy. Yeah. I don't know. I think there's just... I mean, this is like, I want to say stay tuned because I'm possibly writing stuff about this. But yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of sort of where women are coming from on the topic of sexuality, simply because historically women have just, written about it less, been published on this topic less. And there's just this imagined view that it's like, well, it's testosterone and all of this. And that women surely don't experience X, Y, and Z. And it'll be like, actually, I'll read it and I'll think like every woman I know has experienced X, Y, and Z. So, yeah.
By the way,
I want to say that, sorry to interrupt you.
That's all. Yeah.
The last thing, you sometimes see the testosterone thing brought up as being related to like every time we have a mass shooting, somebody's like, it's always men.
Yeah.
So
that's
usually
true. That's true.
And do you think that's unrelated? You think that has nothing to do with genes?
Why it's always men?
Well, men seem more inclined toward violence historically in, I think, all cultures.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sure that is something.
Yeah, I think that probably has something to do with it. I mean, I think like where I think of, here's my gender essentialism, apart from the who gets pregnant sometimes and who never, is I think of something like with this Epstein wanting to impregnate however many women in New Mexico or whatever this was, wanting to spread his seed through the land or whatever this was going on, his DNA. I don't think there's a woman out there with that fantasy. You know what I mean? Like, who wants to do that for an
evolutionary psychologist would say that's because for women, it's been, during evolution at least, until modern technology, it's been impossible.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying is that I think it's rare, though. But what I would say is I would not infer that because this Epstein wants that secretly deep down every man is trying to have his compound in New Mexico and do that. You know what I mean? I'm saying I think it exists among men and not among women, but I would not say that that's like, and men are like, so I would say it could exist among men. It's very unlikely that would exist among women. Because
this is making me wonder whether there is some egomaniacal woman out there who has gone to the trouble of donating like 1 million eggs to try and spread her genes.
Well, she's welcome on Feminine Chaos anytime if she exists.
If nothing else, this would be a great novel.
Yeah.
I should add, kind of in defense of evolutionary psychology, I guess, or at least make an important distinction. So, like, the kinds of differences that were asserted in the famous Damore memo, the Google memo, the guy who said, well, here's why women are less likely to be software engineers or whatever. Most of the things I think he was talking about in that memo are actually not so directly relevant to the kind of theoretical predictions of evolutionary psychology. I mean, the strongest predictions from evolutionary psychology are in the realm of sexual psychology between men and women, and thereafter, the further away you get from that, and you get, for example, that women are more sociable, whereas men are this, blah blah blah. Those I tend to think of those as things there may or may not be survey data in support of, but they don't draw kind of strong a priori support for evolutionary.
Well, for sure, in terms of the software engineers question, I mean, what jumps to mind for me is just that so many professions they'll be male dominated for a while, then female dominated for a while, and then the stereotypes around them will be like, oh, this is really for more nurturing people, and this is really for more assertive people. And it's like, it just depends who, for whatever cultural reason, happens to be dominating that profession at a given time. So, and also the salaries will change depending which, so I think it would be very, very tricky to talk about something as modern and specific as being a software engineer and pin that to evolution.
Okay, and but as for the other set of asserted differences by evolutionary psychology, having to do with sexual psychology and the nature of choosiness about mates and so on, I guess my assumption going into this, I think, is still intact, which is the only place you see people who call themselves feminists embracing those, saying, yeah, that's right, this is a difference between men and women, at least on average. And not that it's beyond changing through environmental, manipulation and so on, but aggregate differences in the real world that are at least to some extent due to genetic differences. The only feminists kind of embracing that are the kind of, IDW feminists, you might say, but feminists on the right. I mean, it's that kind of cluster of self-described feminists that I see saying that kind of stuff, and you're not aware of another.
I don't know. I feel like Kat and I are further from that than maybe the more sort of.
I'm curious, when you say that you see feminists on the right or in the in the intellectual dark web embracing that kind of evo-psych notion of differences between men and women. Or can you give us a specific example of what you're thinking of?
It counteracts what I would have guessed on that.
I think Christina Hoff Sommers buys into it.
I feel like Kathy Young would be the opposite, but maybe I'm.
Now, is she an IDW?
I mean, she's
adjacent.
Adjacent, sure.
She's IDW adjacent. Is that I guess that's a clinical designation. She's IDW, yes. But she's IDW adjacent. Right. I should say, I know women personally who are evolutionary psychologists, and in some cases they've been, kind of pioneering important ones who would subscribe to this, but they're not out there kind of writing about feminism in the same way. Now there is actually
more demure than that.
What's that?
I said they evolved to be more demure than that.
The women I'm thinking of do not fit the description.
I was joking. It was a joke. It was a joke.
I mean, what I'm thinking when you talk about these distributions of traits according to according to sex, I think about that where it shows like the curve that goes up like this, and then there's the one for women that goes like that, and then there's the one for men that goes like this. So they're slightly separate. On average, you get men more interested in working with things and women more interested in working with people, but there's so much overlap between the two that when you're talking about something like feminism, which is aimed largely at, providing opportunities within a culture and resolving cultural issues, I guess the question is how useful, honestly, is it to focus on the distributions according to evolutionary psychology that create this minor, but on an individual level, not significant discrepancy between how women are and how men are?
I'm not sure minor and not significant on an individual level is language I or other people associated with evolutionary psychology would subscribe to. But so no, I would say it's actually, it's not, I would say the differences in my experience are not trivial, but one thing that I think is really important though, in terms of like with the Epstein thing again, I do think one difference is that the sort of generally being preyed upon by the opposite sex when you're 14 is something that I think probably many women have experienced, and probably not so many men. That's something where I think, I don't know if it's culture or biology though. And a kind of difference it might make is I think some evolutionary psychologists would predict that it's actually more traumatic on average when it happens to women than it is when it happens to men. I mean, we have no good data on that, I think, but that's the kind of thing you might expect. I should say another name that comes to mind is Diana Fleischman. Do you know that name? She's probably loosely associated with the IDW. She is an actual evolutionary psychologist, but she does kind of write about some of this stuff. And an interesting thing about her is that perhaps in defiance of some of the stereotypes you might think would emerge from evolutionary psychology, she's an advocate of polyamory and so on. So she's not. She's no Phyllis Schlafly, believe me. Anyway, I had a conversation with her, if you go far back enough in my podcast, so she's another example. But anyway, did you start to say that actually you think that there may be progressives who are more inclined to progressive feminists who are more inclined to see some relevant sex differences as to some degree innate than you two, or did
I think so. I mean, I think in terms of like what Kat was talking about, this notion that every time a man and a woman get together, inherently the woman is in this situation, the man is in that situation, just by virtue of one being a man, one being a woman.
But she's at a disadvantage every time.
I mean, I think that it's not that I don't see any truth to that under any circumstances. And as I've said, I think there's just like biology is what it is, you know? Mm-hmm. But I think essentialism, to use a sort of a different way of putting it, and this notion of sort of infantilizing women, I think we really step away from that, Kat and I. So I think, I don't know. I don't identify as, I always forget if it's, I always want to say international dark web because I'm here I am in Canada. Intellectual. Yeah. I don't think I'm intellectual dark web, but I also.
No, I think it's safe to say you're not. But I will say the IDW feminists I'm talking about are very anti-infantilizing. And so it's not, and I'm thinking of some who I think do believe there are significant innate gender differences. They're very anti-infant. I mean, these are not complete Me Too skeptics, but they're the kind who are, I think they're inclined to draw a line and say, you know, some of the things at the Aziz Ansari end of the spectrum are kind of crazy, or unwarranted grievances. So I wouldn't associate this idea about gender differences inherently with infantilizing women. I see the nature of the concern, though, absolutely. And historically, there's been a lot of association between the two, I think.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about things like, like the Google memo that caused such an uproar, where, it was an attempt to explain some, through EvoPsych, some of the discrepancies that you see, in terms of who becomes a software engineer and who doesn't. That even if there's truth to that, and, I don't see why there shouldn't be, that on average, obviously, maybe women prefer to do different kinds of work, are less inclined towards math. Actually, I just remembered that I saw something interesting, which was that women who are really good at math tend also to be even better at verbal abilities, and so gravitate towards that. So that's interesting.
That would completely explain my math and science high school and how things played out there.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. But yeah, so the thing is, like, even if, you have these, you have this gap, where you're likely to end up with more men than women in a given field and more women than men in a given field. On an individual level, if a woman wants to be a software engineer, what does it mean what do the averages mean? Like, are they really relevant? And I think that when we talk about what feminism wants to address, we're thinking about the girl who wants to be a software engineer and making sure that she has an equal opportunity to do that. And if she chooses not to because she's disinclined to do so because she's a woman and women just are disinclined, that's fine, but the opportunity should be there.
Yeah, I should say, by the way, again, that I don't know that Damore tried to use evolutionary psychology to kind of make the case for that particular kind of gender difference. My own view is that it would have been hard for him to do because there isn't really the theoretical connection between the two when you're talking about those vocation-specific aptitudes. But in any event, a question that grows out of that, so are you saying you don't accept the idea that differential outcomes are clear evidence of discrimination? That in other words, you're not trying to get the world to a point where you have 50-50 gender representation in every vocation?
No, I mean, that seems unrealistic. And in countries where, there's already great gender parity, you do see discrepancies in terms of, who enters different workforces. And I think this is something that's pretty widely known, that in countries where women are still treated as second-class citizens, you actually see a lot more of a 50-50 split in terms of who's doing what jobs. In countries like Sweden, where feminism has been a thing forever, you do have these, one sex is more represented in a given industry and so on.
I mean, you could also make an argument that there are, in certain instances, there's a case for 50-50 representation that isn't because that's what nature needs and because people are naturally all the same, but there'd be some other reason why in that job or whatever you would want like best actor and best actress at the Oscars. Is it because half the amazing performers are men and half are women by nature? No, I mean, that's how you do it. I don't know, something like that.
So I said, but before we started taping, I called your attention to a tweet I saw this morning and thought it'd be worth talking about just because it happened to happen this morning and it's relevant to this whole thing. And let me, before I get your reactions, kind of set the stage. So I guess Jonathan Martin had written a piece in the New York Times saying that, well, let me read from it. I actually have a couple paragraphs. Few candidates inspire as much enthusiasm as she, meaning Elizabeth Warren, does among party voters, blah, blah, blah. Yet few candidates also inspire as much worry among those voters as Mrs. Warren does, even as she demonstrates why she is a leading candidate for the party's nomination. Ms. Warren is facing persistent questions and doubts about whether she would be able to defeat President Trump in the general election. The concerns, including from her admirers, reflect the head versus heart debate shaping a Democratic contest increasingly being fought over the meaning of electability and how to take on Mr. Trump. Okay, so that's the piece. Jodi Kantor, who is a friend of mine, although we haven't talked in ages. Anyway, she famously, was involved in unveiling some of the initial, Me Too scandals, including some of the most egregious, like Harvey Weinstein. She's a reporter for the New York Times, won a Pulitzer Prize for that. She tweets, is there a handy term, in reference to this article, is there a handy term like mansplaining or microaggression to describe when someone likes a woman, meaning Elizabeth Warren, but defers anyway to others' more negative views? And then she says, someone please coin one quick because I see this all the time in reporting and in life. I have a reaction to that, which probably is reactionary or something. I mean, it's a reaction, might as well be. But do you guys have any response?
I just don't think that's a woman-specific thing. I mean, to like somebody, but to have doubts about their widespread popularity and to be reluctant to support them on that basis, that does not strike me as a gendered behavior.
No, I mean, I think there's a whole debate that we don't have time for now about whether to consider electability or not, whether it's just sort of self-defeating for the Democratic Party to sort of think of those terms. But yeah, I don't see, I guess this is not a thing I have seen out there in the world, this pretending. I guess it's something I've only seen specifically discussed, not even in terms of the election, but specifically in terms of Warren. This question of like this sort of proverbial man who didn't like Hillary but would like Warren, but then here he is not supporting Warren. Whether this is a meaningful demographic of voters, I have no idea.
Yeah, so maybe in light of your reactions, my reaction isn't so reactionary. In fact, some of my thunder, I guess, has been stolen. I mean, my first reaction is, what should we imagine that this is about gender? I'm asking this about all candidates. I like Bernie's foreign policy a lot. I'd be happy to see him president, but I worry about his electability. And I think somewhat the same thing about Sanders. And I was surprised. So that was my reaction, is like, wait, do we know that this, I mean, isn't this a thing that people have long asked about presidential candidates and has, that has long led at least some people to recalibrate their support in light of who they think is electable. But I was surprised nobody, there were maybe a dozen replies to the tweet. Nobody raised the question. They just joined in the game of coming up with labels as Jodi requested.
Well, that's Twitter. I mean, when people have a big presence on Twitter, and certainly if you're a Pulitzer-winning journalist, you will probably if you want to. I don't think the replies a tweet gets necessarily. There's a lot of people. There's a lot in the not spoken on Twitter. I think there's people thinking, "Huh," and in the direct messages saying otherwise, or just not nodding along.
Right.
Yeah.
But who wants to be the person in the replies who goes, I don't think that this is a gendered behavior, and gets accused of mansplaining or worse?
It also, like, it doesn't strike me as a thing, but the fact that somebody has seen it out in the world seems plausible to me, and I'm not offended by it. Like, it's just, Yeah,
no, it could well be a thing. And also there's a kind of a variant of this. It could be, and I haven't read the whole Jonathan Martin piece, that some people are saying the reason she can't get elected is because she's a woman, middle America's not ready to vote for her, whatever. And then a question arises, if that's part of your explanation of why she can't get elected, is that a different kind of, transgression of proper belief or something? But anyway, I mean, sometimes people do get ratioed on Twitter, but I guess maybe there are kinds of people who get followed around by their ideological adversaries who are just waiting to pounce. And then a lot of people aren't in that category. Their followers are sympathetic and nobody dares defy them. But I was a little disappointed that nobody took the opportunity. Of course, you might ask, well, why didn't I? And the answer is I didn't want to get accused of mansplaining.
Yeah.
Right. So that's Twitter.
If this is your way of asking us to go in and reply for you, the answer is no.
Okay, then I'll just go in and like, I'll take a snippet of the video from both of you and
that's mean.
And stick it in the replies. How about that?
But I said I wasn't offended by it, and that I believe she says she's seen it.
You're on slightly safer ground than Kat, but
Kat's just gonna go viral for.
I've been canceled before. I'm sure I'll be canceled again.
Oh yeah, what did you just get into trouble for? You got into trouble on Twitter for something big time, and then you said, "Oh, I spent." Well, maybe I'm getting, but you did. There was something you got ratioed for, right?
No, I don't.
We're talking. Yes, there is. I insist that it's true.
Oh, is this?
This is classic mansplaining. I know more about your past than you do.
I'm just trying to think what it would have been. It
wasn't necessarily about. Oh, I know what it was. I could have the wrong person, but I don't think so. Didn't you say like the idea of condemning some 19th century guy for sexism when they didn't even yet have the theory of relativity or something?
Oh, yeah. I did not get ratioed. I got some angry responses, but I did not get ratioed.
You didn't get ratioed technically. There's a quantitative threshold for ratioing, which you did not exceed. Okay. But
right.
You got into some Twitter trouble.
I mean, I wouldn't even, it didn't even rank at this point in my top 10 Twitter troubles. But I did say that I thought, and this was in response actually to a profile of P.T. Barnum, it was about a biography of P.T. Barnum, where the writer wanted to talk about how we couldn't ignore the fact that P.T. Barnum was like a lousy husband, which, just showed that he was, that he was bad towards women. But I mean, he was a lousy husband in a way that I think pretty much any man at the time, it was an unexceptional lousiness. And he's not exactly known for being a real stand-up feminist guy anyway. So, why bother?
No, I thought that was a good point. And then the tough question comes with like on how fine a scale do you want to apply that, right? Like, okay, what about somebody 30 years ago, 20 years ago, or just 5 years ago, but they grew up in a particular household? The larger question is, to what extent does someone's context...
I want to hold forth on this, but I see what time it is. But
I know.
All I will say on this is that things... the simple answer is you just compare people from the same period. So, I mean, my PhD is sort of history adjacent, and somebody like Émile Zola would have been problematic in certain ways today, but was obviously not problematic for his day. But then also there's this question of and this is something that the political science professor, Jacob Levy, has written about, like, is history actually moving towards progress? And he and I are both skeptical on that front. So then the question is, like, maybe the people today would have been canceled in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, for different things.
And somebody, I guess it was, what's his name, Cass Sunstein, made the point, which I mean has been made before, but someday we all may be condemned. Those people who eat meat may be condemned. I think may well be condemned. I mean, that seems to be pretty obvious. The day will come when people can't believe people ever ate meat, in part because the meat substitutes will taste great, and so nobody will bother. But anyway, I digress. Is there anything big I've missed that you want to say about feminism before we bring my tutorial to a close?
I think I'm feminismed out.
You think I've been fully enlightened?
I think so.
As enlightened as you can be, as a man. Just kidding.
As a man and as this man. Both are handicaps, but I do the best I can. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having us on.
To both of you. The show is Feminine Chaos, available on bloggingheads.tv as well as on YouTube, and importantly, as an audio podcast, if you can't sit down and watch. And thanks to both of you, Kat Rosenfield, the memorably named Phoebe Maltz-Bovey. And I encourage people to comb through the Feminine Chaos archives, and maybe we'll do this again down the road. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.